right, folks, it's time for our Word Politics show that we do every Tuesday and Thursday right here on Pod TV. So definitely some great conversations that are about ready to take place, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing from some esteemed guests that we have with us here on this particular show and all along that line. And of course, we've got some of our regular panelists that will be joining on this conversation and all in that kind of things that we'll be talking about both on the national and the international lanes and all in that kind of way. I did see that Sarah Huckabee Sanders has endorsed Trump for president. So that was one of the things that I saw in the news. And of course, some people are getting ready to find out what's going to happen in this third debate, which is this week as well. And there are five candidates that apparently have qualified. And of course, we do know that Mr. Trump is not showing up at this one either because he's got a sizable lead. And I'm thinking that he's thinking that why jeopardize the lead by participating in the debate and all in that space. So definitely it does look like we are heading into a rematch between Trump and Biden. I actually went out and did some voting earlier today. I know I could have done early voting, but I actually went and voted on the day of the election, and that was for our municipal elections. We've got an election that is going on that is going to determine our mayor right here in Durham, North Carolina, and that is between a business gentleman and a gentleman that has been in politics, Mike Woodard. So I went over there and cast my vote and also cast it for three of the city council people because they do that whole rotating city council kind of system. And some of them are up for re-election and some of them are not. But we will determine whether some of the incumbents come back into office or whether some of their challengers come into the office as they had the runoff today. I was actually talking to a friend of mine and going like, you mean I went to vote for basically two contests? So that's all that was going on this particular ticket was literally two contests. But I'm going to bring in my very esteemed guest and see what he's got to say about some of the things going on in the world, and particularly some of the things that are going on both in Israel and in the Ukraine and Russia situation as well. So the first guest I'm going to bring on is retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack, and I hope that I pronounced that name correctly, but if I did not, he will let me know and all in that space. And I've definitely even seen him quoted in a couple of publications that I follow on a regular basis. So I do know that he's been following what's been going on in the war as well as what's just going on a military level. Because one thing that I've learned from my cousin, because I have a cousin that is retired from the military as well, he never could make it up to Brigadier General. He was trying to make it to Lieutenant Colonel. I don't even think he made it to that rank because they have this whole thing where if you don't make a rank by a certain time, they will retire you. So my cousin Emmett got retired before he could make it up to Brigadier General and all along those lines. But it does look like Peter Zwack has had some amazing career. I know that you were in that first Ukrainian war and definitely have been following what has been going on in that war, as well as some of the things that are going on in the Middle East as well. So it's my great pleasure to have you on the show and to have us share some of your thoughts about what you remember from that first war and what is going on currently, and even some of the things that are going on as far as Israel and Palestine, and maybe even some of the other hotspots. As I know sometimes we don't think about Africa and Asia, but there are a number of hotspots in our world that don't always get the attention, particularly in this day and time, that say the Middle East and Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, are getting. But I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about your own background and your own life story. And of course, I do have some questions, and I'm sure that some of our guests will as well. But it's just my privilege to have you here on World Politics.
Mark, thank you very much for the invitation. I smile at the question, the array of questions you asked me, and we can get into them. But how much time do I have? Because that will control how I try to expound on these or not.
No, I mean, the show is about an hour, but sometimes we go over. And all along those lines, I did mention in our email back and forth that I would love to hear your reflections and your thoughts about the Russia-Ukraine war and where we are with that, and even some of your thoughts around Israel fighting against Hamas and all in that space.
All right. Well, an honor. Thank you for the invitation to you, and great to, through you, meet, if you will, your listeners. I think, I can't remember, Mark, I'd be curious in the discussion. Can you know, we're all children of the Vietnam War. I can't remember in my lifetime, and I'm pushing 70, a world so complex and so frazzled all at once. While there are great things going on, I don't want to paint a completely negative portrayal, but I worry that our kids, our grandkids, and kids, anybody under 25 years old, have no recollection of 9/11.
Mhm.
It's a shock and trauma, I think, of the last two generations for our own country.
Right.
But in the last 18 months, we in the US and in whatever we call the greater West, but the world, have faced now two really world-class strategic, military related, but it's much more than that, crises going on. One, the Russian invasion of Ukraine just 18 months ago. It seems like forever ago, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it probably seems like for many of us, we're almost numbed now into barely thinking much about it, because what just happened a month ago was the most horrific bloodletting that I think that we've seen in certainly since the Second World War. And I'm saying again, in our whatever you call our greater Western world, and this is it, and it's on them. Both of them are unresolved. I think they've opened up a Pandora's box of issues that are not just military, but social, political, ideological, religious. And it's all sort of coming at once. I believe that the Russia-Ukraine, while distinctly different than what the horror that has been occurring in with Israel, Hamas, Gaza, you can't fully look at them through separate lenses. They are interwoven, even in our own politics. And how are we going to support one or the other or both? And I have opinions on that. I believe that the world as we see it, it's forcing us into looking at it in a even more strategic way. Allies, oh my gosh, our allies are more important than ever. Being clear in our messaging. How can you be clear in your messaging when it is these are complex issues, especially the thing that's broken out in with Israel and Gaza, where you have. It's hard to look at these things dispassionately because the passions and the furies are now out, and leads to a lot of things. All right,
No, that gave me some great insights, and definitely, well, I'm sure that some of my panelists will have some thoughts around all of what you just said and all along those lines. But the other reason that I wanted to bring you up, and it is a issue that I am very passionate about, even though I did not serve myself and all along those lines, but I do an event regularly that is a honor of the veterans. Is actually tied into, of all things, the Apollo Theater in New York with my good friend Captain Newborn, who ironically is not a captain in the military. That's actually literally his first name and everything. But he is a passionate person around the veterans, and sometimes feel that you veterans have not gotten enough just dues and enough support even after you have served. And I do know that there are some health issues around the veterans, and some people are not that pleased with what the VA has done, even though I understand that they have improved and all along those lines. But as Veterans Day is on this coming Saturday, I was just wondering your thoughts as to both your own service as well as to how you feel we are doing in terms of veterans' rights.
Thank you for that entree, Mark. If a family has a veteran as part of it or part of the history, that family is also a veteran. We have to look at it, certainly for those that have served overseas and abroad. But it brings in, again, when we honor Veterans Day and our veterans, and I am a proud veteran. I very, very am, very, very much. It is we can never again forget our families and the people that we have, our support structure, those who support us, those that are patriotic that may question us, but for the right reasons. All of this is what Veterans Day is. And we have been in some conflicts of late that have been divisive and well, they're always complicated. I appreciate the bulk of the population supporting the veterans. Now, the support to veterans. I think that the VA does as good a job as it can. And when you consider that it's dealing with millions of veterans, when you're going all the way back to God bless the few remaining from the Second World War and the Korean War and Vietnam. And remember, the veterans issues on the medical side are not just physical, but they're also psychological. And you know, and these things way back were going on. PTSD in World War II, or Korean War, or even Vietnam. There wasn't a name for that. It was just combat fatigue and all of that. So there's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of support. There needs to be more. But I think that when you consider our process to a lot of countries in the world, we're not bad. And you know, care is uneven, and it's in part determined by location. I don't believe, and yes, I may have a bias there, I don't think veterans should be have their you know, their retirements taxed and things like that in certain states. But that's you know, that's sort of a side issue. Honor your veterans, honor the family veterans, the youth, the younger generation that has seen all this, but blessedly hasn't been really sucked into it like our fathers and grandfathers. Honor your veterans, say thank you. Thank you for your service. It does mean a lot to us, but I will also come back with the statement, thank you for that. But I will then ask, are you paying your taxes? And the person usually says yes. And then I will tell them, thank you for your service, because you are part of the whole nation that we have to, with all our warts and all our flaws, need to stick together. And that's serving, and that allows us to serve more effectively abroad and at home.
Before I bring in our other esteemed panelists, as I promised I would do and everything, one of the other things that I was curious to ask you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, is we are in the middle, and I mentioned it at the beginning, of a presidential race, a presidential contest, and there are some people that think that neither one of the gentlemen is actually fit to be commander-in-chief and all along those lines. But I'm just wondering, do you feel that the politicians are doing enough to support the military? I know a lot of times the even conversation around how much money we're spending on the military comes up as well. But as a retired brigadier general, are you pleased with the way that either the House or the Senate or even the presidents are doing in terms of their support of the military?
Yes, I mean, again, it's, and when there isn't support and you know, what I would call, you know, basic great Americans, part of it is just cognizance of the veterans and what they do. We have a society, I believe, that is less connected to their military. But maybe that's a good thing up to a point. But I think there are segments of the population that are not patriotic in regard to veterans, but just simply are not fully aware or know. And so part of it is an awareness piece. Now, when people will occasionally play politically the veterans card to, you know, generate interest and votes, and then once in, back off. No, that's not helpful. But I believe that, again, I think most want to support veterans, Many of how much of our political class now, how many of them are veterans now? It's a very small percentage. And that doesn't make the veterans better than people, but it does matter. It does matter, and it presents awareness of these type of issues. So again, I think tragically, it takes a major conflict or something like that that engulfs large portions of our population, or something very controversial that increases veteran awareness. That's why I mention how important that we honor the families, because in many ways, that's where the support structure first and foremost comes for those veterans. And it was the families after the Second World War in that greatest generation that did the most, I think, to keep the veterans together as the VA and things like that were developed.
No, and in that same line and all along those lines, I know that I mentioned at the beginning, and you kind of alluded to it as well, those two conflicts that everybody's watching on the news, and it is definitely tearing apart in some ways our country and everything. But you were a brigadier general. You've definitely dealt with some of these countries, and some of that we haven't talked about as well, including some in Africa and Asia. So with such divide, even in some of the areas that are going on, what advice would you give? And I'm sure that you're still in touch with some of the generals that are active and all along those lines. So those folks that are dealing with, say, a Middle East, where you've got a side that is maybe pro-Palestinian and a side that is very much pro-Israel. And we know Israel is one of our major allies and all in that space. So it does seem like it's very complex issues that are being dealt with. And I'm sure they were even complex when you were brigadier general as well. So what kind of advice would you give, or have you given, for those that are putting on and trying to come to some resolution in these situations?
Mark, I just have to tell you and your audience, I started in the Army. I walked off the street near Greenwich Village in New York and enlisted. Had hair down to here. It was 1980. And enlisted for 3 years as a private first class, and then went to officer candidate school, and then and OCS, and I was going to serve for 3 years and get out of the Army and go into business, in the wine business, believe it or not. And then I don't know what the hell happened. I ended up staying in the Army for 34 years. So many of these issues and things, I wasn't particularly aware of these issues, except I am a teenager of Vietnam, and I'm trying to remember, was it the movie with John Voight, but Coming Home? Was that the movie?
I think so.
About a veteran that comes home in the margins of the Vietnam War and has to deal with all these issues. But all of this now, we have our veterans and that are come from Iraq now, and the Vietnam veterans. God bless, we can't forget them, but they're really now getting on in years. And I believe, as a young Army lieutenant at the time, who had a platoon, 1980, and I think of the hardest time it must have been for a young Army lieutenant in recent generations would have been that Army lieutenant that had to lead a platoon in Vietnam, say 50 guys, who didn't want to be there. No, nobody wants to be in war, but they were draftees. They doubly didn't want to be there. And how do you pull them together and motivate them? Even go take that hill. And so my era was early in the volunteer Army, and that made a difference. But that type of the learning and learning how to deal with people in situations, but the will to fight. Now I'm coming to Ukraine. What we're seeing is, what we have seen in 18 months is something rather remarkable. And that is the unexpected. We knew they'd fight. Defense of the Ukrainian defense of their homeland. And it keeps teaching us lessons about, I know it sounds maudlin, but about liberty and being a free-minded nation. That doesn't mean you're a perfect nation. Ukrainians aren't perfect. But the Russians, I think that part of their failure early on was their disdain and arrogance to the Ukrainians as a real people and a real country. So they invade and they're not ready, and they meet this determined buzzsaw that all of a sudden in the first week has the anti-looking Winston Churchill in Volodymyr Zelensky, who's looking Vladimir Putin in the eye and said, "Back off, I'm not flying out here, I'm staying." And they stayed in Kyiv, and I believe that first week they won the first phase of the war. And that comes to a lesson for all of us, and that's leadership. Inspired, credible leadership, courageous leadership when it's necessary. And it doesn't mean being in front of bullets. It could be hard issues. So we saw a lesson in leadership. And the man has been there now for 18 months. So he isn't a flash in the pan. And yeah, he irritates us at times and is trying to, get more support, but he's fighting at the helm of a nation under existential assault, will do anything for his nation. And the lessons that pour out of that are extreme. Now, when I talk about arrogance and hubris and underestimation, I look at Israel, and I'm all in with Israel, but I am an old combat intelligence officer, and I know that trying to anticipate the move of a potential foe is hard on a good day and really hard on a really opaque, cloudy day. Now, I believe what happened with the Israelis, in part with that superb intelligence system they had, Shin Bet and Mossad, was the same human factors in part that affected the Russians and how they assessed Ukraine. Meaning, I think that the Israelis, and again, I'm all in with them, they, I think, had a disdain for the Palestinians, kind of looked down on them a little bit, and they just didn't think the Palestinians could pull something like that off, even though they had to have had a torrent of indicators, but they didn't connect the dots, and they had a failure of imagination. That's sort of what I think. It's a little bit like us in 9/11. We were getting all the information in bits and pieces, but couldn't connect the dots and had a failure of imagination that something so big and monstrous could actually be accomplished by these guys. I think that's a little bit what happened with the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I believe that's what happened somewhat with Putin and the Ukrainians. And so I just throw that out there as a psychological aspect of it. And you got to check your work, not just in the methodical way of adding up tanks and airplanes and capability, but you got to check your own wheelhouse and say, you got to go through your own critical thinking in your headquarters and who you're talking to, and can't let politics drive it. We've learned that repeatedly.
Speaking of things we've learned repeatedly and everything, and I'm going to bring in the two founders of the network, and I've got other people I'm going to bring in as well. But as I bring them in, that being Kim Calhoun, who is one of the founders, and Nick Palveda, and all in that way. So they are glad to have you here, and they are definitely the founders of the network. And we've got a bunch of other folks, including Jim Eads, Zafra Star, who is originally from Ukraine, and as well as Rick Rosner and Jim Ead and a number of others. One of the things I was curious to hear, and we've also got Frank, and Frank is involved in the gas industry, is my understanding from Kim, but he can explain some of that, and we might get some questions to him as well. But one of the things I was curious about, Brigadier General, is one of the things that I've heard people complain about is, and you kind of alluded to it, is how we sometimes are knowledgeable, but we don't always want to acknowledge what we know. And there were some people that would even say that we knew about the attack on 9/11 and we could have prevented the attack. I've heard some conspiracy theories that go even deeper than that. And I've also heard some people that have said that we have this bad habit, and I don't know what your thoughts around this, but of training those that then turn against us. Because there are people that have talked about how we have trained some of the members of even Hamas. We definitely trained Noriega and some of the folks in Latin America and all in that space. But I just wondering your thoughts, because I do know that we sometimes train people that we are thinking of allies or they are strategic allies, but then sometimes they, I hate to use this analogy, but they stab us in the back. Mr. Zwak, your thoughts, and then Rick has a question for you.
Okay. I would like to hear one or two of your panelists, and then I'm going to come around to it.
Well, let's bring Rick on because he had
all right. I just want to say that Russia seems to be the common denominator in a lot of horrible stuff that's going on right now. There are rumors that Russia may help North Korea expand its nuclear arsenal. Russia just has a general interest in destabilizing and weakening of Western democracies. And so if Russia, and Russia Putin rolls the dice, let's try all this different stuff. Help Iran. Iran helps Hezbollah, helps Hamas, creates, we have this intractable problem between Israel and Palestine now, no good solutions. The world is pissed at Israel, even though Israel suffered, this heinous attack. And all this serves to domestically make Biden look bad. I'm not sure exactly why, because when the U.S. was attacked on 9/11, Bush's approval went to 95%. Biden's approval is down to 38%. So anyway, that's all I've got to say, that Russia's happy with the chaos.
Well, let's put it this way. I completely agree with you in that, Russia has had major challenges regarding Ukraine. And even with the slowing down of the counteroffensive, it's still brutal and bloody for the Russians. And while the Ukrainians have been slowed, the Russians have not won. But this has turned the world attention to away from Russia to the Middle East, and I think this is a blessing. It has also turned the bandwidth of the world, dangerously so, I believe, away from a steady support, a reliable sense of support to the Ukrainians that are again in this existential fight. And we've got to, in our place in world Americans, and our allies, and I see a note on the chat about NATO, and I'll talk about that later. We've got to be reliable. And again, the Ukrainians are in a desperate fight. They're not perfect, but they're standing up to the closest thing to authoritarian, on the edge of totalitarianism we know on the world, other than China. And so Russia, come back to the point. They who invaded Ukraine. I was in Moscow for the 2014 invasion. It wasn't pretty. They now are invoking. They want to be one of the arbiters in helping the peace, ceasefire and all of that. The Russians in Ukraine, so there you go. That puts an amber light in your head. They also have now taken a position that is pro-Hamas, well, pro-Palestinian, and by insinuation pro-Hamas, which is in my mind a code for being anti-American, anti-West, rules-based order, a term that they hate. And so they're playing it both ways. And anything that gets, the eye away from their absolutely, despicable behavior regarding Ukraine, this is good. And it now roils our world. It's our allies. So it's interesting. It'll be to see what happens with the Russian-Israeli relationship, which had been kind of neutral, okay. They had sort of I think, had an understanding in Syria where the Russians were, because Ukrainians were keeping the Islamists, the radicals, down. But now there are so many, I think, plate tectonic changes that are going on with the relationships, whether big picture, us and them, that won't change. The role of Iran, who they're really, really, really working with, how much in the background were they to all of this? Meaning they have, I think, missions to Hamas, and let's watch for Hezbollah. And so I think this is getting to your earlier point. For Russia, this couldn't have come at a better time because it's completely deflected the global attention off of them, and it's taking it off of Ukraine as well.
So I think the other thing that it's allowed the Russians to do is use energy as a weapon.
Yeah.
And they're using energy as a weapon in concert with their allies like the Chinese. And I think that's another issue that's kind of sliding under the radar screen here that will continue to play a bigger role, because that's a pocketbook issue for all developed countries and all developing countries. And so I see that as a real issue that's started to emerge that may also bolster that same argument that it was making earlier.
Hey, Frank, along those same kind of lines and everything, one of the things I've heard people talk about, and I know Sasha and even Jim may have some thoughts on this as well, is that I understand that we actually have, and I know that you're in the oil situation and do a lot of writing and stuff around oil from my conversations with Kim, is that we actually have the resources even here in the United States and don't need to necessarily depend on OPEC and some of the other things that we are still dependent on. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, because
I'll just quickly say, yeah, we've done a good job over the years of starting to develop our own resources so that we're less involved and less reliant on the Middle East, especially on the oil front, by using natural gas. But that also has helped us become a better ally for the Europeans, who are heavily dependent, or were at least heavily dependent on Russia, and still somewhat are. And the only other real aspect that's real interesting now is, as we move towards an energy transition to, away from oil in some cases and more towards electric vehicles and solar panels and things like that, we now become even more reliant on places like China, who have a box on not only the development of critical minerals that we need for all those things. They're also they corner the market on the processing of those materials as well. And so part of what we're doing here in the U.S. is trying to do a similar thing to what we did in the oil markets to make us less reliant on the Middle East. The next stage of that fight is to make sure that we are less reliant on Russia for their nickel, and China for all their critical minerals that they have access to and the processing that they have. So for me, that's really a great opportunity for the U.S. to jump in and be a good, not only help domestically with our energy policy, but at the same time, be a very reliable ally to our friends around the world who are stuck in a similar situation.
I think you bring up a critical point that we've just touched on, and I saw it again in the texts here. NATO's and allies, and I message out, the only thing, the old line, if you remember, going back to I think World War II, the only worse thing than an ally is no allies. Mm-hmm. We are blessed, and it's difficult and it's frustrating, and the cost sharing isn't perfect, and we have different ways of looking at things, but we are not alone in this world unless we choose to be so. I've spent much of my life in the world and around the world, and I think that to drift back into, I understand, in sort of isolationism that's really counting our dollars and pennies. Certainly, I understand that, but it misses like we missed it before World War II and World War One. We've got to stay engaged out there in the world, even with the trade-offs. When you have allies like Europe and in Asia, those are also great business markets. It isn't just about military for us. And when you come to a crisis like this or these, it gets complicated, but we have real allies. Russia, really, who's our ally? They have a big partner in China that plays a little bit, cute with them. But pushed against the wall, they would probably pull together because they got no one else except what? Iran. And oh, by the way, can you imagine? Could you believe, ladies and gentlemen, the sight of Vladimir Putin, almost like a supplicant, going and meeting Kim Jong-un of North Korea, last month in Vladivostok, basically looking for weapons and ammunition of the type that the Soviets used to sell give to the North Koreans in large amount. And you call that greatness? But they pulled together, in some type of weird 21st century axis, if I could use that term. And I don't throw the axis of evil, but you just look at what the axis was before World War II, how it developed in the late 30s. And these strange non-ethnic, non-culturally linked nations like the Nazis, the Italians, and the Japanese, and some Eastern Europeans pulled together because they're like-minded authoritarians and they see what we stand for as a threat. We have, I think, a mutation of that going on today with, I already mentioned them, with Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. You have what you call the
BRICS nations
is will look at us dimly because of colonialism history and all of that. So there's just a lot going on. There's a lot of history to learn. Let me put it back to you.
Definitely. And I know that folks are wanting. So Sasha, I'll turn it over to you. I know Rick's got his hand up and Jim too. So Sasha first, then I'll go Jim next because Rick, you've already spoken. But Sasha, Jim, and then Rick. You're on mute, Sasha. I'm not hearing you. Sasha, I'm not hearing you.
Now can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, I've learned one thing on this programs: never underestimate Russians. And the person who taught me that, it was Adam. He always told me about his love for Putin. And at first I rejected that notion, but then in the last couple of weeks, I understood the wisdom of Adam's point. The wisdom is, you're very welcome. The wisdom is this. Obviously, Russia is much weaker than not even NATO, but just United States alone. It's much weaker. It's a technologically backward country. It's socially backward. It's just name it one by one. But there are two qualities that Russians have that West lacks big time. This is determination, number one, and passion, number two. These two factors level out all others. Look at what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Ukraine was very close, actually, to kick Russians out of its territory back a few months ago. What did West do? They betrayed Ukrainians. They didn't send them the weapons that they promised to send them, and they urged Ukrainians without any air force to barrage into Russian position, which was heavily fortified, minefields, like incredible minefields that never in the history of the wars were ever erected. So the West says to Ukraine, go, attack, beat them up. With what? There are no ATACMS missiles. There are no F-16 planes. There's nothing. How can you do that? So they tried their best There is a stalemate right now, but that benefits Russia big time because it has much more resources than Ukraine. They producing not very efficient weapons. It's probably 40, 50 even years old weapon system, but they work. They work. They can kill people. And that's what they're doing. And where is the West? Well, they have a Congress, they have problems here and there. Now Israel is in play, and so on and on, and here and then. So Ukraine now is a lost case. Now they have problems in the government. Now there is a talk about that Zelensky is no longer effective as it was before. Yes, he's not effective because he failed this attack a few months ago, and there is nothing that can resurrect it. So Russia is now infiltrating all Western world with their propaganda, with their trolls, and they're going to universities, and they are creating all these left useful idiots who are brainwashing our kids and grandchildren. And this is what Russia, this is all Russia doing. Israel, Hamas, Russia. Anything with Iran going on, Russia. So you just don't understand what you are up to. Peter, are you agree?
I'm here.
Yeah, he's with you.
We agree.
What do I think?
What do you think? Yes, exactly.
Well, I have to push back on one word, and that is the word betray. I don't believe we in Western Central Europe betrayed Ukraine. We were slow. Yes, and that is 2020
hindsight. You know what? It's even, excuse me, it's even worse than betrayal. Betrayal, okay, you didn't send anything or so on. So Ukrainian would not attack Russians without any support from the air and without any proper ammunition. What you did, though, that you promised that you will deliver so much and that much in that period of time, and you urged Ukrainians to start their attack back in June, July of this year, and then you know what's happened. No, you want to replace betrayal with some other words, please do so.
There was look, it was slow. You go all the way back to February, March, April of 2022. I sometimes use the phrase, you are where you are when you were. Now, the Russians had just come in en masse, massive invasion, horribly executed, horribly planned ultimately. And we were dealing with the other massive nuclear-tipped power in the world. And yes, we now know that the red lines and all that was bluff, probably meant it up to a point, and then they kept falling back psychologically. There was no intention, though, in my mind, to betray the Ukrainians. We were slow. We were bureaucratic. We had to, we argued about what this and all of that. That was not anti-Ukrainian. That was just, we were just slow. And yes, we look back, it would have sure been nice to have some of these weapon systems earlier this year or late last year, but there was a lot of stuff that did go in, sir. The early Stingers and Javelin were decisive in the first push, Russian push on Kyiv. And then HIMARS became really arrived just before the pushback at Kharkiv, and more. But yes, the airplanes, it was slow. It was also a political issue. These are political nations, and they have to work within their own system. Now it's coming. Regretfully, it's not where it is, but there has been a lot of support, and I think that even with our complications and our upcoming politics, that we will stick with Ukraine. But there was no calculated, in my mind, desire to make Ukraine unsuccessful. And yes, there was a calculus and a concern. And it wasn't a cold-blooded one. It was a concern that if you provided, and it was wrong, all right? It was wrong, and I'm agreeing with you, that if you give the Ukrainians, and this was earlier, all these long-distance weapons, Now they're firing deep into Russia with all the, with all that could happen from that theoretically. And I think those were the reasons that people got cold feet and were slow, but no desire, no intent to betray.
Hey, Jim, you had a question? I saw that you were next on the list, and I know that Adam's got some thoughts as well, but Jim, it's on you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm going to make some statements. If I may have a question, I don't know it yet. But Peter, sir, I really admired what you have said and enjoyed listening to you talk. And it's not going to sound like it when I say the next few things, but I really have.
Far away.
Yeah, I have a great deal of respect, and I'll circle back to it. But I think that the thing where you're just talking about, which is not why I wanted to respond, but what you're just talking about, we have to remember that Tucker Carlson was on Fox News saying, "Why are we supporting Ukraine? Why aren't we supporting Russia in this?" And our former president Donald Trump was. Pretty much taking whatever Putin was saying as gospel. And we have a current House Speaker who wants to separate Ukraine support from the Gaza and the Hamas situation, the support for Israel. So these are political problems that we're having. There's no question about it. And you're right to mention that. But there has been a lot of isolationism, which is a word that you used, which I have been talking about for a while. They want us to stay out of it, don't spend any more money on it. So we need to keep a rallying cry for supporting countries like Ukraine, who was invaded, and the horrors that were inflicted upon it by terrorists, intentional rape and things like that to shock and just humiliate another country, and the terrorist strikes against Israel. These are not questions to be bantered back and forth about. We have to take a stand. But I wanted to go back to what you really were talking about earlier about veterans. It's also the families. My dad served in World War II. My grandfather served in World War I, where he was hit with mustard gas. Really thought that was a really beautiful remark that you said, that the whole family's involved. And when you mentioned PTSD, you mentioned combat fatigue, and we used to call it shell shock. We were just ignorant. We didn't know what these people were going through. And so we didn't have the understanding, and we still, in many cases, lack the compassion for these people, for what they have gone through. They can't even articulate what's going on with them. And we have a VA system, a VA hospitals. Many of my friends served in Vietnam. Many of my friends that are now in the VAs for treatment of various things. And they're mostly positive about that. As a chess teacher, what I've done is there's both physical VA and mental VA, and I've taught in both of them. And in the physical VA, I only had a small number of people participating. It wasn't that big a deal. But in people that were in the mental VA, man, it was really rocking. They really wanted it. And I thought to myself at the time, I'm not sure if this is true, but this is what I thought, that they want to be reassured that their minds are still working. And in the VA, the physical VA, where I helped more was not in chess so much, but it was in golf tournaments. We could help them because, they didn't have, visual sight, so we could tell them what direction to aim at and tell them about how much yardage there was. And then we can help them find the ball afterwards. And so these are ways that, even though I did not serve, I turned 18 when the draft was eliminated. I did not serve myself. This is ways that I feel that I can pay back a little bit for what others have done for our country. And I also loved what you said about, paying taxes. It's so rare for me to hear someone say that, but I'm proud to pay taxes. I think it's an act of patriotism. Thank you again for your service. Bye.
Sir, you had stated that somehow I was going to be mortified by what you said. I could reach out on the line here and hug you. I completely agree with everything you said. So just thank you.
Rick, I know you had a question, but I did want to hear from Adam as well. So, Adam, did you have any thoughts? You're the youngest voice here and everything. So, do you have any thoughts about what retired Brigadier General Peter has been saying and some of your own thoughts? By the way, just in case you didn't know, retired Brigadier General Peter Adam may be your next president in about 4 or 8 years because he's actually a professor at Georgia College, but he is considering possibly running for office at some point or another. We've been joking about that here on the show, but I think he's got some political ambitions. But
Go for it. Go for it.
Well, Peter, it's an honor to meet you, and it's just wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you. I just have two quick statements and wanted to get your thoughts. One problem I have when people talk about Russia and Ukraine, Israel, and Hamas is that the situations to me are far more complex than often the political narratives show. I don't think it's just Russia's bad, Ukraine's good, Israel's good. I think it's more complex, and if we're going to have practical solutions, we should recognize that. And second thing I wanted to say is, when we talk about the United States and its moral superiority, I look back to the second Iraq War that George W. Bush got us into, and I think that really compromised our sense of moral superiority, such that when we criticize these other countries, we can be cited for doing exactly what they did. So my question for you is, how can we regain the moral superiority and be a force for good in the world?
Well, by the way, I mean, these are great points, and I think it's however you define doing the right thing. But the question is, who's looking at your definition of moral superiority? We might feel that within our own society, in our own systems, and all of that. And I am all in on Israel. All right. They are in a desperate fight. They are going to take it to them. They've been shocked. They've been grievously hurt. And now they're pounding Hamas back. But in that, in how they're pounding them over time leads to a situation, while with our total support, there will be parts of the world support us, and then parts of the world, it's sort of the non-aligned nations or whatever, and much of the world will be against us because of our support for Israel and the horrendous civilian loss of life that's going on. And again, I support the Israelis, all right, very much so. But this is hard stuff, getting to the gentleman earlier that spoke. I'll tell you, I worried for Israel that this has gotten so ugly, and whether those that would do them and our side harm on the information sphere have been able to take what was a horrendous attack that was there wasn't a 1% of support unless you were a deep Islamist somewhere, and somewhere in there the Israelis have lost. In parts, it's certainly not our world, but the parts of the world, whatever moral authority and ascendancy they had on the 7th and 8th of October, such as the information sphere that we're in, and we are kind of sucked into that vortex along with a number of our friends and allies, and we've got to stick with them while continuing to give them hard advice. So you really raise a complicated issue, in moral authority. One person's high morals is somebody else's, sewer. And I think we're struggling with this in a I can't imagine a Gordian knot, meaning a peaceful solution, Israel-Palestine in a generation or two, because there will be no reconciliation with the extent of violence that's going on there and the two-nation solution that many of us have supported. I'm sorry, you brought up great points. You got me going on the moral authority.
No problem. Rick, you had a question?
Yeah, I have a question for the general, but first a quick rant. We need a national push to come together and quit believing in crazy bullshit. We pulled together for World War II. We pulled together for much of the Cold War. We came together after 9/11. It's obvious that it's to our advantage to support Ukraine, and also from a view of justice to support Ukraine. And my question, Frank talked about all the mineral wealth throughout the world that we need to support, clean energy, new technology. We can't get we can't be the world's friend if the world thinks we're crazy. So my question to the general is, do you think we can pull together as we did during World War II? And how can we do that with so many powerful news media outlets pushing division?
This is again, we're running out of time, and I don't want to, I've already hijacked a lot of the time. I think that I come back to our allies and messaging, and if we are able to stay close to our allies, even with issues, that sets an example. Our own nation, I try to stay balanced and moderate in my politics, but we are going through a scary period in 2024 that will result one way or the other how much of the world looks at our country, not just ourselves. And that's as far as I'm going to go into that. But it'll certainly generate our behaviors. So, I'm that dirty word. I'll say it that way. In the last administration, I served my whole career trying to better our country, work with allies to get things done. But that now, because that makes me an internationalist, I'm a bad guy to a bunch of Americans, and it makes me sad.
Hey, just along those lines, and we can go a little bit over, not too much over and everything, but one of the things I was curious about, and you kind of alluded to it, retired General, Brigadier General Peter and everything, but one of the conversations I've heard, and even I think Sasha has mentioned it on his show, Ukraine, Russia, and China, is China's involvement. And China is definitely going into other countries. They're coming into the United States. They're going into Africa. They're going into a number of other places. So even to some of the questions that you've been asked, how can we maintain an involvement in world politics and even in other parts of the world? I mean, I know some people are interested in our involvement in Latin America and our involvement in Africa, but I don't know that we have a concrete policy in terms of international relations. You are a brigadier general, and I was wondering, do you think that we have a concrete policy? And if not, what could our policy be? Because I'm thinking we're letting some of these countries literally take over. There's like a neo-colonialism that is taking place, but it's with China and not necessarily with
and that neo-colonial thing is sort of tagged on us. But yes, there is a neo-colonial aspect to China. But friends, I will just say what's happened now in the last month, and then the last year and a half. The last month has, I think, going to twist and bent a lot of the assumptions and relationships in the world, and how we're going to be doing foreign policy and with whom. What has happened, I think that whoever designed the Hamas attack and the spiders in the web beyond Hamas were wildly successful beyond their belief to vibrate the world and get the street talking in ways that I think are going to pull and yank political alliances, national alliances. How are we this work with the Abraham Accord with our last administration, and Biden team followed up on it in getting closer with the Saudis and the UAE, ostensibly was one reason people surmise that they wanted to create havoc with Israel and break that all up. So there are a lot of assumptions and relationships that are going to be tested. But I think what is key is we've got to stay tight with NATO. That's answering your question that was there. And we've got to stay close with our Asian allies. What was remarkable was the work that was done to get South Korea, and a number of you are probably Korean veterans. I have a son there now. And Japan to almost on the defensive side reconcile in a way that would have been unbelievable even a few years ago. So we have to continue to work the margins, because right now the the center is in royal. The messaging, the way we look at the world, I think has been upset somewhat at the head. Whole new generation of youth, younger people are experiencing something that many of us did and have not, and having to adjust. And then on top of it, you throw on social media and AI and cyber and all of it, and you get quite a stew going.
Yeah.
Well, and I have to jump off here, so I just wanted to thank you for doing this, General Zwick. But I also wanted to just mention one of those things substantively where we can, again, continue to build those bridges is in the energy space, right? Because we're energy rich. And so the more we can use our energy strength as a diplomatic tool, the better off we're going to be. So that's just another thing that I'd leave everybody with for that as a means for getting us to whatever we want, whether it's an energy transition, whether it's just helping our friends get a more comfortable energy transition, and it just gives us a leadership role
Everybody needs energy.
Absolutely.
Frank, along those lines, I know you got to jump off, but hopefully you'll come back on this show on a regular basis and everything. I've definitely enjoyed some of your remarks.
We'd love to come back, and I look forward to it. Sorry, I have to jump off early.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you very, very much for the invitation. I'm honored.
Yeah, no problem and everything. Sasha, you had a quick question?
Peter.
Very quick question. U.S. Took very inflexible stand pro-Israel, 100%. Now, don't you think that administration underestimated the fact of a huge pro-Palestinian lobby around the world, a lot of pro-Palestinian demonstration, anti-Israeli demonstrations, but the most horrible things in that is a worldwide anti-Semitism, which today commands many nations, including United States. Look at what these liberal professors are doing on campuses in U.S. universities, including Stanford and including several other leading, like even Harvard and many others. So what, in effect, U.S. is putting themselves in a very, very dangerous situation, unless it's prepared to fight anti-Semitism all the way.
Well, as we have, this is, as the Middle East has done, and that is pulled us in more and more, and the narrative now is toxic out there. And you're right. This has brought out, the demons that have these classic intractable furies, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all of that. And it is raw for all those first generation students in schools and universities around the world, where they're still finding themselves and their identity, and now they're faced with it. While there were always problems in the Middle East, really you had 82 in Lebanon, and you had the Intifadas, but you had really not since the Yom Kippur War in 73 did you have such a dramatic blowout that has just gotten everybody so passionate, and the fact that the media is doing their job. I may not like some of the spin and all that, but to broadcast these things, the horrors of these, it's made this thing uncomfortably close, and it makes people take sides. And I'm one that's completely caught. As I'm a pro-Israel guy, have been forever, been there, worked with the Israelis, but I'm of the mind that they should have went in hard, but to continue the way they're doing it, rather than going into small unit operations, which are going to be more costly. Nobody knows the number, but we're talking thousands and thousands of Palestinians dead. And we can say that, the Hamas were among them, they were supporting them, but there were still civilians But it's a mess now, and that has inflamed the world, and it's made moderates especially really, really challenged. So again, I'm all in with Israel, but I am struggling with some of the aspects I've seen.
Yeah, definitely, I can understand that. Kim, you said you had something you wanted to bring up as attention as well, and then we're going to wind down.
I just wanted to have the opportunity to thank you, General, for serving and your sacrifices that you have made. And this has been a very beautiful, informational show today. And thank you for coming.
You're very kind.
you.
Thank you. It means a lot. Thank
Peter,
you.
I think your biggest sacrifice was the last hour being on this show.
I hear, Yaslushu Udarenia. Where are you from, sir?
I'm from Ukraine, Odessa.
Okay, извините, я наговорю.
Yeah, вы хорошо говорите.
But I hear the accent.
Очень хорошо говорите. Thank you.
Okay.
Спасибо.
Очень приятно. Я надеюсь, у нас возможность время поговорить.
Спасибо, дорогой.
Не за что.
Add a little bit of translation, and I'll have to get Sasha to translate what y'all just said and everything.
Done,
Brigadier General, and all along those lines, if you have some final thoughts that you would like to share, like I said, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. You've definitely brought some light to a number of issues, and like I said to the other gentleman, I would love to have you come back whenever you're able to come back. I know that you are oftentimes busy with many conversations and many things that have you on the media circuit and other circuits, but anytime that you are able to come back, we do this every Tuesday and Thursday, and I would love to extend for you on behalf of Pod TV, and I think that Kim would agree with me, the invitation to come back whenever you are available on Tuesdays and Thursdays, because you do bring some amazing insights into what is going on. So
First of
anytime
all, again, I'm honored, and your questions and the discussion helps me. As some of you know, I do get out and speak occasionally in media, and I'm struggling with these very issues and what to say. So I'm constantly talking through really good questions. I think that you can have hard, fixed thoughts, but you've got to be flexible, and I'm fighting to be flexible and not dogmatic and doctrinaire, because this is such a fluid situation. You know, there's the hard black aspect of it, the butcheries, and then there's the white, the humanitarian efforts, but there's all that gray area that we are now having to face, that we've just talked about in the last hour, both with what's going on in Israel-Palestine, less so in my mind with Russia-Ukraine, but that's still there, and we can't forget that. Bottom line, we are all in this together. As veterans have their families, they're in it together. We as Americans are all in this together. To get at your point, I'll end on that. We need to pull together, not tear each other apart politically and ideologically. We've got to figure out a way through this difficult time. And then forgive me for doing this, but you might be interested. My book, Swimming the Volga. It's about my first 10 years in and out of Russia on the very, very ground level that might get into some of these. It's easily obtainable on Amazon, and I'd be honored if you guys, some of you went out and got it. Mark, again, thank you. You and your team, you really got me going. You really got me animated, and at least we're all feeling strongly, which is what the first thing we need is to feel strongly about something. And at that point, we try to bring our thoughts into a more definable future. Thank you. Be safe, all of you. God bless, and if I may say, world peace.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. And on that note, we're getting ready to get on out of here, but this was a very enriching conversation. And like I said, we're out of here.